G'day folks, and welcome to this side-by-side comparison of last Blitzkrieg and A Time for Trumpets. These are two games that both cover the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Offensive in December 1944. They are both presented at battalion scale on very similar map scales with very similar map coverage and footprints, but they are quite different experiences. I think they're both fascinating designs. They're an amazing experience playing each of these. In this video, I'll cover how they differ, how they feel differently, and ideally this will inform sort of your considerations around each of these and perhaps better inform your decision to purchase and play one or the other. Now, the last Blitzkrieg is of course part of the Battalion Combat series. It was designed by Dean Essig and published by MMP in 2016. A Time for Trumpets was designed by Bruno, Sinigaglio and published by GMT Games in 2020. The first thing I want to cover is the components of these games, their scale, and what the games actually represent. I will say at the outset that they are both heavy, complex, long monster games. You're looking, if you're playing the full campaign, you are looking in each of these at dozens and dozens of hours. But of course, there are many smaller scenarios to play within these. Let me talk about some of the aesthetics first. So the maps. A Time for Trumpets comes with 5 22 by 34 inch maps that overlap in places. Basically, you've got, to set the full campaign, you'll have 3 maps at the bottom in portrait mode, and then 2 maps rotated in landscape mode that kind of overlap along the top to give you a roughly 65 inch wide by 46 inch tall footprint. Last Blitzkrieg comes with 4 22 by 34 inch maps that are laid out in a 2 by 4 grid to give you a footprint that is about 68 inches wide and 44 inches tall. So last Blitzkrieg is perhaps 3 inches wider but 2 inches shorter than A Time for Trumpets. Both very similar though. Now, both have numerous one map scenarios to keep you occupied if you're limited for space, and these one map scenarios in each of these titles are still quite deep and detailed and long and satisfying. You get a very full game experience from these numerous smaller scenarios. If you never plan to play through the full campaign, the scenarios that you get in both titles have, again, dozens and dozens of hours of gameplay and replayability. If you're limited for space, both have very good vassal modules, and in fact I'd argue that both of these games are ideally suited for vassal because of the ease of administration of counters and the footprints required. Vassal has become my go-to option for both of these titles. Now, last Blitzkrieg has scenarios set up within the module. A Time for Trumpets requires some additional setup time. Just be mindful of that if you're moving towards vassal. In terms of map scale, the maps are at almost an identical scale. The difference is mainly in the hex overlay, where A Time for Trumpets uses a 1 mile per hex overlay. Last Blitzkrieg has about a 1 kilometer per hex overlay. So in essence, A Time for Trumpets hexes appear slightly larger. If you look at Namur, for example, and compare the distance from the centre of Namur to Mu up in the north, if you remove the hex overlay, it's the same physical distance. The maps are almost at the same identical scale. But in A Time for Trumpets, the distance here is 7 hexes. In last Blitzkrieg, the distance here is 9 hexes. Now, the effect of this is pretty significant when you factor in some other issues which I'll talk about in a moment, because the smaller hex scale in last Blitzkrieg means more hexes within a given area, which typically means when you factor in the higher movement allowance and the time scale, which I'll talk about in a moment, it means that there are more movement options for both the attacker and the defender. It's a critical point which I'll return to in a moment. It means that when you activate a specific battalion to move in last Blitzkrieg, you have more choices because of those hex options and other factors compared to the options you might have in A Time for Trumpets if you're activating, for example, the same battalion in a similar situation. Graphically, last Blitzkrieg presents the terrain features in this environment and then imposes the hex grid over the top for a more natural or realistic look. Whereas Time for Trumpet features hex-based graphical design. The terrain is placed inside of that hex grid. It means that a Time for Trumpets is easy to read. It's easy to see, for example, if you're in a forest hex or a broken hex, whereas Last Blitzkrieg can be more difficult to ascertain that, but it has that more natural map-like aesthetic. Road networks are of course key to the bulge, and both games include fascinating road networks that you can study. Last Blitzkrieg includes three types of roads plus railroads. There are primary, secondary roads, tracks, and railroads, which all facilitate movement. And the distinction between these is critical, again, largely because of the higher movement rates, the variable costs of these paths, and as I'll talk about in a moment, the time scale in Last Blitzkrieg. A Time for Trumpets features two main types of roads, primary and secondary, and while there is a distinction between the two, different movement rates for different units using these roads, it's more subtle and not as important as the different road rates in Last Blitzkrieg. For reasons which I'll talk about in a moment, you're often spending far more time studying that large road network and the connection of primary and secondary roads and railroads and tracks in Last Blitzkrieg, whereas in A Time for Trumpets, you're mainly focused on the immediate road network directly in front of you, perhaps 4 or 5 hexes around the units that are activating. So let me talk about the units in these games. And I'll talk about the component quality here as well. So in Last Blitzkrieg, cannons are about half an inch square, about 12.5 millimeters, versus A Time for Trumpets, where counters are about 9/16 of an inch, or about 14.2 millimeters. The GMT A Time for Trumpet counters are also much thicker compared to the MMP counters in Last Blitzkrieg. The GMT counters have because of their larger size and thickness, they have quite a chunky tactile feel to them, whereas MMP counters are smaller and lighter. Now, there are far fewer counters in Last Blitzkrieg. Counters typically represent combat units, and in many cases, armoured support and artillery support is abstracted by counters directly attached to headquarters. This means that the situation around each of your divisional and formation headquarters can be at times very messy and sometimes confusing, but the situation is clearer with regards to the location of your combat units and their movement and so forth. Conversely, A Time for Trumpets features those armoured support and artillery units as actual counters on the map that you are required to move around, and that adds to, I guess, a sense of thematic realism. You have the actual units here on the map, they're in particular locations, but it also adds to counter density and stacking, resulting in a busier map in general. There are many more counters on the map as a result, and that in itself can be confusing in a slightly different way. As a result, on the map, I have found, interestingly, it's generally easier to handle and manipulate, move around the MMP counters because of the relatively lower stacking and counter density within an area. So despite their smaller size and being light, I found it typically easier to move the counters in Last Blitzkrieg because of that the greater density and stacking of counters in A Time for Trumpets. Despite the fact that they're chunky and tactile and easy to grasp, there's just a lot more counters in an area. It's more difficult to get in there and move these counters around. The payoff is that Last Blitzkrieg abstracts elements such as artillery, whereas A Time for Trumpets, as I said, represents each of these battalions as a unit on the map, and I'll talk more about that effect later on. Let's talk about the system here, and there are two core factors that I think principally distinguish these titles apart from each other, and they are the time scale and the underlying activation systems. A Time for Trumpets, first of all, the underlying system. A Time for Trumpets is an I go, you go system. The German player activates armies and cores within those armies one at a time. Within activations, they first move all the units of the active core, and then they engage in combat with all those active units of the core. Once they're done, they move on to their next corps, the next German corps, and then the next German corps, and so forth. You do movement and combat within each corps one at a time, and you move throughout your entire force. Once the Germans have done everything, you swap over to the Allies, and then they do the same thing. Activate an army, a corps, and then the units within that corps for movement and then combat. In contrast, last Blitzkrieg features a back and forth formation activation system. The Germans, for example, might get the initiative. They go first, they activate a single division or formation to activate. And within that formation, units within that formation can move and attack invariably throughout that activation in whatever order they want. Then the Allies might get a single division activation, formation activation, and they do the same. Then it goes back to the Germans. So it's a more dynamic back and forth system with movement and combat entwined as part of that activation system. What I mean by this is when you activate a formation, you typically pick a battalion within that division or formation. If they're an armoured unit, an AV unit, and there's an enemy force adjacent, they can force an engagement immediately as the very first thing they do as part of this activation. They might force a retreat of that enemy unit, and then they're free to move elsewhere, perhaps to another unit, and engage that unit. Or they can move and wait for another battalion within that formation to move up. So the next battalion might then move up and attack that hex, win and advance into the hex, and the third battalion might activate and move through the captured ground. So it's a far less structured, more open and flexible and dynamic system in terms of what you can actually do within an activation. Now, another factor to consider here, and it's an important one when you're considering multiple players, is downtime. Because a player impulse in a time for Trumpets is quite long, and a typical army impulse runs for over 2 hours. There's a lot of downtime for the inactive player here. The only thing they're doing during that time is choosing really what artillery to fire in defence and when to use that artillery. Now, there are optional rules for responses and reserves, but it's relatively small, and to be frank, the inactive player is spending a lot of time not doing much. Indeed, the US player on the defensive is doing relatively little over the first 2 days in a time for Trumpets, even in a smaller scenario. And it's a 20 plus hour small scenario. That's a long game with not much for the US to do. The US player over the 16th and 17th of December is mainly moving a small number of units around to plug gaps, to block these roads, to engage in occasional small focused counterattacks. Now, this is great for solo play. I've played these games only solo, not against anybody else, and they're both fascinating systems, but fair warning, if you're playing against other people, they may not necessarily enjoy that downtime. Being the largely inactive US player versus the Germans, be warned about that. Conversely, the activation system in last Blitzkrieg, despite the Germans being on the offensive and the US being on the defensive, there's relatively little downtime. Both players are regularly engaged, and because of the different time scale, when the US player does activate a formation, they tend to do more with their units, and they're doing substantial things with these formation activations on the 16th and 17th of December. Okay, let's talk about time and movement. The second key difference between the two titles is the time scale used, and it's critical here. Last Blitzkrieg plays at 1 day per turn. A time for Trumpets plays at 6 hours per turn. That difference is huge, and I'd suggest it's the key factor you may want to consider in deciding whether or not you want to play one or the other. A time for Trumpets is 6 hours per turn. Units within that time span often aren't moving very far, and after all units move, they all engage in combat. And then the enemy has time to react and counterattack, which means roadblocks and interference, which means more combat. And that happens 4 times throughout the course of a day. A pre-dawn turn, a morning turn, an afternoon turn, and an evening turn. 2 of those are day turns, 2 of those are night turns, with different rules for units during day and night. Last Blitzkrieg at 1 day per turn incorporates a system where, as I said earlier, movement and combat can take place invariably throughout the course of an activation. An armoured unit or a division can, as I said, move, fight an engagement and keep moving, and then fight another engagement, and then, as I said, you can activate these other units. The combined impact of that system and the time scale is that last Blitzkrieg feels like it moves faster. It feels more dynamic. Both sides are more consistently involved, and it shifts your attention to focus on broader operational activities. You are, in last Blitzkrieg, more regularly looking for breakthroughs and exploitations. And you're looking at the road networks kind of in the broader region to see where you may be able to break through and how you can do it and what you can do beyond the front lines, all within the course of a single formation activation. You're looking to see how you might be able to string movement and different types of combat together in a sequence to facilitate that breakthrough, and how you can sort of crack the front lines and move beyond. Now, for example, within a single, let's say 10-minute activation on the 18th of December, you can potentially attack US forces near Clairvaux, force them to retreat, then drive west through the gap and be on the outskirts of Bastogne, potentially, if you're lucky. Time for Trumpets is much slower, more structured and more granular in detail. When you activate a core, as I said, all units of that core first move slowly, then they stop, and then they all engage in combat. There are, of course, advances after combat, and those advances can be quite critical, and there are certain blitz tactics you can use to give you additional movement, but generally you're moving, engaging in combat, advancing a little bit. And then your opponent can respond. This system then shifts your attention to that sort of more immediate tactical level. You're still looking at road networks, and you're still looking, for example, to exploit near Clairvaux and drive west to Bastogne, but the clearing of those road networks happens slowly. That breakthrough is a slow build-up and development. You gradually pick apart US defences, break down their defences, force them into difficult, stretched out situations, and hope their line breaks at key points, and hope that they can't bring units over to plug those gaps during their following activation. If you're playing a smaller, for example, 5th Panzer Army scenario, that breakthrough to Bastogne, perhaps on the 18th of December, might take you about 10 or more hours of gameplay to enact in detail over time. It's still a breakthrough. It's doing much the same thing, following the same roads with the same, let's say, 2nd Panzer Division units. It's just drawn out into smaller segments. Shaping this also is the combat system. The combat systems are also vastly different between the two titles. Time for Trumpets uses a standard combat ratio and combat results table system with dozens of different possible modifiers and column shifts for weather effects, divisional effects, ground combat unit effects, and many other sort of tactical situational effects. This means that as you're focused sort of on this tactical level, you're looking for key locations to attack, and you may be looking to bring as many favourable factors to that combat. And they can include things like engineers, reconnaissance units, tiger tanks, Stugs. You may want to bring your units to facilitate a flanking bonus, or bring enough combat factors from various directions to get a really powerful combat odds ratio. You'll also be moving critically your Nebelwerfers, your field artillery, on later turns your air units into a position to support your attacks. Indeed, the support units, artillery, Nebelwerfers, and air units are critical in a time for Trumpets, and I'd argue that effective and superior management of artillery is one of the most important factors in determining localized victory or defeat. And by management, I mean moving your artillery, battalion by battalion, into positions where they have ranged targets, where you are maximizing artillery for combats in terrain favourable to that artillery, and utilising that artillery support in combats where the additional combat factors they bring is critical in shaping the outcome of that particular battle. Because artillery can only fire once over the course of an impulse, you need to use each of your battalions carefully. If you fire them all too early, you won't have any artillery ready for later combats. You may focus on one or two attacks in critical positions, or a series of weaker attacks along the line, but you're doing all your movement first, getting your forces into position, and then attacking. You add up the combat factors, determine column on the CRT, apply shifts and modifiers, and roll to determine the outcome, which is typically a defender retreat, attacker retreat, or something in between, like an engagement result, counterattack, or step losses. When units take a loss in a time for trumpets, they're reduced to the next step down. This is typically on their reverse side. If they're a one-step unit, they're eliminated. Sometimes they're replaced by a different counter in the counter pool. Often in retreats, they'll be forced into elimination by the lack of a retreat path that is clear of enemy zones of control. If forced to retreat into an enemy zone of control, they're eliminated. And that's really what the Germans are trying to do: surround the Americans, cut off their zones of control, and retreat and force elimination via that means. Last Blitzkrieg, in contrast, features what is in essence a combat differential system. And there are several different types of combat, but they all use this differential system. For example, armoured units can perform an engagement against other armoured units, or they can seek to disengage armoured support from a particular unit. Armoured units can attack by fire a stack without armour. They can engage in shock combat against a hex without armour or armoured support. Units that are assault capable, typically infantry, can attempt a regular attack against a hex to try to capture it. So different types of combat are used in different situations. There are typically up to about a dozen modifiers that apply to these combats, up to, some of them are much lower, benefiting attacker or defender. You add up these pluses and minuses, roll 2 dice, apply the modifiers, and determine the outcome. The results may be step losses, situational retreats, or full retreats. Now, combats are quicker and easier to resolve in Last Blitzkrieg compared to a time for trumpets. The complicating factor here in Last Blitzkrieg is that there are different types of combat, and the different types can only be used in certain situations, such as if you have an AV or armoured unit and the target enemy hex doesn't, then you can use certain types of combat. Artillery is abstracted in Last Blitzkrieg, and formations are allocated a number of artillery points as indicated on their headquarters counter and as artillery attached to those headquarters. You can spend these artillery points in combat, and they'll typically add a +1 or a +2 modifier to the combat result, or you can make a destructive barrage to try to cause step losses on the defenders. It's much quicker, easier, and while helpful, artillery is less critical and less important compared to a time for trumpets. And again, it's abstracted, so they're just attached to the headquarters. They're not individual units that you have to move around. They effectively move with your headquarters and those formations, the blobs that you're moving around the map. Now, to track step losses in Last Blitzkrieg, you place administrative number counters below a unit. Units are never eliminated because of retreats in Last Blitzkrieg. If a unit is forced to retreat and they can't retreat because of zones of control, they simply take another step loss and hold their ground, in effect making a determined or desperate stand and losing losses as a result. Now, the critical difference between these systems is that in Last Blitzkrieg, as I said, combat can take place anytime during an activation, and it can immediately be followed up by the movement of more units within that formation that's active, and you'll be blending different types of combat with movement to perhaps disengage enemy armour in an area, then follow up with infantry to clear a crossroad, and then follow up with more armour to break through. So as I said, this creates a fascinating dynamic where you try to plan out a series of movements and combats of different types to chain together to achieve sort of a larger goal. The structured system of a time for trumpets is more sequential, more methodical, and it creates different types of decisions, mainly revolving around short-term, immediate tactical goals. You may certainly have broader objectives in mind, such as driving towards Clairvaux, but first you need to move up and attack hexes along the Our River. So you are planning for those immediate short-term goals, hoping for the best, and really, whilst you've got your eye on the bigger prize, you're not really thinking much about what will happen around Clairvaux. That's not to say that you're not working on operational planning, just that your plans for attacking Clairvaux play out over 10 to 12 hours of gameplay in a time for trumpets, compared to the quick 10 to 10 minute bursts of an activation within Last Blitzkrieg. Okay, this is sort of moving to talk about the pace of play, and that really sums it up. The two games are doing much the same thing, but at different paces, or rather, the the speeds of the game are focused on different elements. To put it more accurately, a particular division performs an entire day's activities in 10 to 12 minutes in last Blitzkrieg. They activate, you plan, and often you're spending 5 minutes planning, and then they'll quickly have this burst of activity, and then they're done for the day. Whereas in a time for trumpets, those, in effect, same activities are drawn out over 10 to 12 hours, over 4 turns reflecting 6-hour increments. And whilst you're moving units of that division, you're also simultaneously moving all the other units of the corps and the army. But this means that that division and their 10 minutes of fame and burst of activity in last Blitzkrieg are then left waiting until the next day to activate again. And they have to wait through the activation, perhaps of a dozen other formations. And while each of those divisions are acting within 10 to 12 minutes, that adds up to quite a few hours of waiting. So what does this all mean? It means that in the last Blitzkrieg, you activate a formation and you need to pause and plan their 10 to 12 minutes of activity very, very carefully, because they will not be active again until the next day, and that's a long time for perhaps your opponent to react. So you need to study the situation, study the road, study the potential for both your exploitation, study where you can move and follow up attacks, but also study where your opponent may respond and block you. Develop a plan, develop a sequence of activities, and then get that machine started, roll the dice and see how it unfolds. Now you can change the plan along the way, consider options and alternative roads. If a critical combat fails along one road, you can change the plan for that formation immediately and start to consider a different road. But that's where your attention is focused, and in doing so, as I said, you may be planning the paths for a subsequent activation by a neighbouring division. You'll be clearing a crossroad, eliminating a unit, hoping that an adjacent division can move through, or trying to disrupt a defender's headquarters, or trying to seize a key crossroad before your opponent can. In a time for trumpets, all your divisions are moving one after the other towards those short-term objectives within the one broader long impulse, with a sort of a long-term, almost glancing or hopeful view towards those paths or crossroads or defenders' headquarters. You move first, engage in combat, see the results, wait for your opponent to respond, and then move again. It's not quite the fast-paced, rapid movement of last Blitzkrieg, but a broader, more granular, grinding, rolling approach. All your units are moving at the same time. And you're still responding to victory or success in combat along the way. If you force a breakthrough in one area, you'll try to divert forces to that area. But at the same time, your opponent has their time to respond, and of course they can respond with their entire corps rather than just one formation. So you're not making the same long-term plans, rather you may have long-term goals in mind, but you're setting almost immediate objectives, hoping for the best in the short term over the next 6 hours, and then waiting before you develop the next stage, the next series of short objectives in your plan. And each of those short 6-hourly objectives combine to build up towards a larger sort of operational plan. And this really is the crux of your involvement. In last Blitzkrieg, every 10 minutes with each formation, you're developing these series of longer term plans, this sequence of activities: move, combat, move another battalion, combat, move, exploit. And it's a fascinating process. In A Time for Trumpets, you're making plans for an entire corps, almost your entire army at once, conducting all movement for that corps, and then all combat. But you're more limited in what you can plan for, and thus it's a different mindset. You're mainly planning for particularly focused combats during that 6-hour turn, rather than planning for longer term exploitation. In last Blitzkrieg, you plan for exploitation and hope for good short-term combat results. In A Time for Trumpets, you plan for good combat results and hope for long-term exploitation as a result. So let's contrast, for example, the situation in front of the 2nd Panzer and 26 Volksgrenadier divisions on the 16th of December. In last Blitzkrieg, the Germans are hoping to use their infantry to clear out the relatively weak defenders of Holzingen and Marnik to open clear roads to the north and west to enable their armoured units to cross the bridges, which open on the 17th of December, to drive on through. You'll notice generally a maximum of 2 units per hex in last Blitzkrieg, with those administrative counters focused around the headquarters. The headquarters always have these administrative markers attached to them. For example, armoured units of the 110th Regiment, 28th Infantry Division are noted as red support next to the 110 28 HQ in Clairvaux. And the headquarters, shown here upside down as finished at the start of the scenario and that's unable to activate, has 1 artillery point to spend. You can see that on the unit. The 2nd Panzer Division headquarters has 3 artillery points, and the 26th Volksgrenadier also has 3. Now, the defenders of Marnik and Holzingen have 2 steps. This is indicated at the very top in a very small number on the counters. And it's likely the infantry of the 2nd Panzer Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division will eliminate those 2 steps relatively quickly. Now, to reflect their defensive posture, the 110th 28th headquarters has what's called a prepared defence marker shown sort of next to them near Clairvaux. So the Germans plan to eliminate those 2 defenders, and they hope the combat goes well enough such that if they get a second activation, they can follow up with enough infantry to get close to and possibly even across the Clerf River by the end of the day. If not, they'll likely cross on the 17th of December. A time for Trumpets reflects more detail. It reflects how some of these units have already crept across the river. It also shows more of the dispersed units of the 110th Regiment, 28th Infantry Division. We can see, for example, the 707th Tank Battalion near Wilderwils to the south, and various artillery battalions and anti-aircraft battalions shown on the map. Now, those dispersed units of the infantry are also in established forts, which provide considerable combat benefits on defence. So whilst the infantry of the 2nd Panzer Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division would, in the long term, love to drive across the Clerf River, depending on combat results, they may be held up by some of those dispersed but fortified formations for several turns. They'll need to clear Holzingen and Marnik and then drive west towards Munzhausen before having to engage in combat against those US units lined up near Drafel and Wilderwils before they can cross the Clerf River. It's possible they'll cross the Clerf late in the evening on the 16th of December, or more likely early sort of pre-dawn on the 17th. So the same situation, simply reflected in different levels of detail on different time scales, providing some different ways of thinking about the situation. In last Blitzkrieg, the Germans are almost immediately thinking about how they can cross this river. In A Time for Trumpets, the Germans are thinking more immediately about how do I get through these forts? How do I bring enough forces to bear to get these forts out of the way, these dispersed units in forts, so I can sort of move forward to the next line of American defences, with a long-term goal of crossing the Clerf River. Same objectives, but being thought of in different ways. Now, while both games are heavy and complex with considerable learning curves, I would say that both rulebooks present what initially seems to be a moderately complex game. The curves become quite heavy as you dive deeper. A Time for Trumpets has a heck of a lot more historical detail and, as I said, granularity, with accompanying restrictions and exceptions built into the scenarios and situations around the map, and it's quite infamous for it. The rules in various scenarios dictate when each unit may activate. They'll often dictate where specific units must move to or what activity they must do. And there's a hefty 60-page scenario book dedicated to setup instructions and the various rules guiding those different divisions. This means that initially, usually on the first couple of turns of a scenario, you're kept to a strict historical schedule. Units become active when historically they were active. I think it's best to consider this much like the arrival of reinforcements. You expect reinforcements to arrive on a specific turn, so too units become active on a specific turn as they're active historically. It means you must sort of set out in the initial directions laid out for these divisions, corps, and armies. And as I said, this is just for the initial few turns. The harness is sort of loosened particularly from the 17th of December onwards, and you have once units become active, they have a lot of freedom and flexibility. So the 2nd Panzer Division, for example, they Once they're active, they cross the river and they can move south, they can move directly west towards Clairvaux, or they can shift towards the north, towards Seville. You are not. The only thing really restraining you are the other rules around movement and stacking, and of course those American forces in your way. Conversely, last Blitzkrieg does something similar by making some formations inactive on the first turn. And I mentioned the 110th, 28th being flipped upside down to show that they can't activate on that first turn. But it's based on formations as a whole. Their headquarters are the centre of their activation. If the headquarters are flipped, they're inactive, rather than having restrictions on every sort of specific battalion in the game. You have entire formations inactive rather than particular battalions being inactive. So I've put somewhere between 40 to 50 hours of gameplay into each of these titles, and my experience thus far is that they both enable you to accurately recreate the history, if that's what you want to do. Last Blitzkrieg probably has the greater potential for counter-historical movement by virtue of its 1 day per turn system, and the fact that a lot more can happen within a formation's activation compared to the slower, granular pace of A Time for Trumpets. For example, there are some truck units in last Blitzkrieg that have movement rates of 12, and if moving along a primary road, which costs a quarter of a movement point per hex, they can potentially move 48 hexes along this primary road. So it's quite a difference compared to the sort of slower movement rates and costs of A Time for Trumpets. In terms of supply, both games incorporate important supply elements into their designs. In last Blitzkrieg, the main consideration is how each formation's headquarter traces supply from their location to a supply combat trains behind the lines. The nature of that supply path, called a main supply route or MSR, whether it's clear or chaotic or mixed, good roads versus bad roads and other considerations, provide die roll modifiers to a unit's activation roll. That activation roll determines if the headquarters and the formation as a whole gets either a full activation and full movement, a partial activation with partial movement and partial artillery, or a fail activation where they can't do much at all. And that, as I said, determines how far they can move and how much they can do in their activation. So it's an abstract way to reflect supply and cohesion and coordination. A Time for Trumpets has dedicated supply and command phases for units. They trace command and supply from armies through corps and division HQs down to every particular unit. The penalties for being out of command or out of supply may be column shifts, movement restrictions, and restrictions on artillery support, getting sort of communication to support artillery for affected units. So it's somewhat similar, but again, more detailed. You're looking at supply for every particular unit, and in that you're tracing supply for every unit rather than just the headquarters in last Blitzkrieg. In this regard, A Time for Trumpets is more detailed, more time-consuming, and more difficult, but it's another element that you can target for exploitation in that, again, on that tactical scale, you are often, in A Time for Trumpets, aiming to cut off and surround particular battalions to restrict supply and command as preparation for an attack. In last Blitzkrieg, you're more thinking broader and bigger and aiming to cut off and surround entire formations, less so just one or two units within those formations. So in bringing all of this together, while these appear to be similar games on similar scales, they provide very different experiences. The fine detail and granularity of A Time for Trumpets and the 6-hour turns and the Igo-Yugo system focuses your decision making around key combat situations. You're often focused on just one or two enemy battalions to focus for a core activation, or one or two hexes at a time, and bringing the forces to bear to facilitate success in the hope, or as part of a longer term plan for a breakthrough or towards an objective. Last Blitzkrieg, with its daily turns and back and forth activation system, focuses your decision making on broader operational objectives and what you can achieve with sort of particular activations. This means that the two games feel different. They offer vastly different gameplay experiences. Last Blitzkrieg feels more operational in nature. You're looking at enemy forces right in front of you, but also the open roads beyond. Time for Trumpets feels, I almost say, grand tactical. You're looking at the roads right in front of you and how you can move your forces to immediately attack the enemy with the greatest odds ratio to thus hopefully facilitate your larger plans. So folks, as I said, these are two amazing games. They're both very heavy, very complex games. They both have very large learning curves. Despite having invested 40 to 50 hours into each of these titles, I still feel like I'm somewhat at the beginning of the learning experience. Having most of the rules established for both games, I'm still now learning the broader strategies, tactics, and ideas that you bring to these games. So in closing, look folks, they are both great games. I hope this has been informative. I hope it gives you some sense of what they feel like, how they play, what you're thinking when you play these games. Ideally such that you can pick the game to kind of suit your gameplay style, to suit what you want to play, whether you're a solo player, playing two players, or sort of team-based gameplay, or, as I've done, pick them both up and compare the experiences and get different experiences from playing through both of these. That is Last Blitzkrieg and A Time for Trumpets. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope it's been of value, and take care.